So I'm going to talk about these three projects. The first one, Project Row Houses, which I started over 20 years ago, and that's ongoing. And you know, people often ask me the question, you know, how do I stick with this project for so long? Well, it's constantly changing and evolving and offering new and different challenges that keeps it very exciting for me. And the second one is Translation in the Vickery Meadow neighborhood of Dallas. It's been going on, I guess we started in 2012. Yeah, basically 2012. And it's ongoing. And then the third one is a project that has not, it's a proposed project that I'm still waiting on that opportunity when it'll actually kick in, because I think there's some interesting possibilities there. At least for me, conceptually, it challenges some of the notions about art and community in a way that I think would be vital and interesting it'll add an interesting voice to the conversation around arts and community engagement. When this community group was going through advocating for buildings to be torn down, I didn't have any good reason to speak against that until I stumbled upon these little houses here and was trying to figure out how to do some kind of project with myself and another group of artists that could impact a low-income African-American neighborhood. And I was able to actually start to conceptualize this little area with 22 little shotgun houses as a site that could be a platform for quote-unquote social sculpture using the term that Joseph Beuys coined in the 70s. And so this idea about social sculpture is, you know, how can we take like a place within the community and pull people together to actually help build it in a way that is not just a reflection of an individual artist's perspective, but it's a process through which everyone engaged and involved in making it happen. So just from the very beginning of this project, it was basically we had to rely on kind of alternative ways of connecting with people in terms of just actually getting it going, because we had no money, no resources. And so we did all kind of events, like for instance on the lower left-hand side was our first art action on the site, and we put together what we called a drive-by exhibition, because we knew that at that time, that was in the early 90s, when people talked about drive-bys, they were talking about drive-by shootings, right? And so we knew people wouldn't come to this neighborhood and walk around, so we figured if we could get them to drive through, then that would be a connection. And that kind of gave us, that started to layer the project with a kind of a poetic language and poetic expectation that separated it from the normal kind of community development effort into something that was more artistic. And we continued along that line by, you know, trying to be imaginative about how we do this work of community development in a way that separated it a little bit from the traditional community development work. Okay, so you take a neighborhood basically that everybody's basically said that there was no value, right? But then you can start to kind of layer it. You have to make things, I mean, the thing that community development does that's different than what artists do is that their end goal is the practical application of what it is they're going to do, right? So somebody who's interested in doing housing developer, their end goal is to, what do they call it, butts in beds or something like that, you know? That's their end goal. But as an artist doing housing, yeah, getting people in beds is an interesting thing, but it's not the ultimate thing. I mean, the ultimate thing is like, how do you create something that has a poetic quality that can resonate in a symbolic way with people, that they can actually, you know, create a narrative around it and show different possibilities of humanity. Right? So that's kind of the goal of that. And so we started out with these little shotgun houses as a way of really trying to challenge the community to think about its history, the culture, and so on and so forth, in a different way that somehow could add value. And so over time, you know, we develop a program where we have artists that come and do art projects, and we have educational programs where, you know, youth. We started out mainly working with youth, and then we decided to do a housing program, and we found that there was a segment of the population, young mothers, that we thought might be a way to address symbolically how do you care for those that are less well off than others? And so we set up a transitional housing program for single mothers. And that was kind of how we got into the housing part of what we do. Having arts programming became a vital part of this, right? Because that way we can always keep a layer of that kind of, that unfettered playfulness, dreaming that you can always do, right? So, when you get involved with the housing and education and all that kind of stuff, sometimes you can get kind of bogged down because of regulations, rules, and expectations, and so on and so forth. But having the arts component to it will always give you that edge that you can kind of open it up and be a little bit freer with it, right? And so we actually rely on this arts program that we have at Project Row Houses to be our pipeline to kind of adventure, and that we can kind of continue to explore things and the important thing is that it helps us keep our identity as an arts project, so that even the social service works or the educational stuff that we do, it's still kind of, it resonates with people as something that's more than just a social service thing, so it gives us a lot of leeway to do things differently. As I said, we worked with youth to engage them in the community and as a way of mentoring and educating them, but also helping them understand how they could participate in the regeneration of the neighborhood as well. Now, the transitional housing program for single mothers that I mentioned, how do you do housing in a way that makes it that it becomes artistic? So for us, we're always trying to figure out how do you layer it, right? So the first thing was like to take the house, a shotgun house that most people would say that they have no value, they're not fit to live in, but how do you make them livable? In a way that pushes the boundaries of what people think is possible. So we worked with designers and all to redo the interior of the houses. And so on the outside, they're these little shotgun houses, but inside they're very elegant, right? And so we pulled together this program for single mothers in a way that was kind of aspirational for them, right? As you're reading the quote from Asada Richards, who basically, we treat this Young Mothers program, we kind of, they're introduced to the program in a way that we challenge them to think of themselves as a work of art, that they're sculpting their own lives every day, all the choices that they're making and so on and so forth. And a lot of that is through programming, counseling, and so on and so forth. But a lot of it is also about expanding their network and so on. Over time, we were able to preserve the 22 little shotgun houses with a kind of model community, right, that had arts and cultural programming, education programming, and housing. But then, intuitively, there was this sense that, that there was this void in the neighborhood and somebody had to play a role in filling it. And so we started to explore. It was very intuitive on our behalf, though, to just start acquiring property. So we continued to acquire property, and then we later were faced with the challenge that people had all the time. They were like, houses are going down, and there are no new houses for people to move into. So that's what got us into building new houses and trying to figure out how we could provide better housing for people in a neighborhood that was losing housing stock. And so we found ourselves in this situation where we were kind of, we're strong on preservation, but also trying to look to the future in terms of what we wanted the neighborhood to look like and what we thought would be a good way of honoring that history. And so we work with Rice University School of Architecture to develop all of our architectural programming. Now, the challenge, though, is that you can see that in the red there's where Project Row Houses is, and we're kind of wedged in a triangle between three large economic drivers. On the southwestern side is the Texas Medical Center, which has been growing and booming like crazy. Then we have the University of Houston on the southeast side. And then on the north, we have downtown. And each of those entities are kind of pushing their way in toward where Project Row Houses is. So then you get in a situation where, more and more people are trying to move in, so you get these larger scale, more upscale, townhouses and condominiums and so on and so forth, and they're just wiping out the smaller houses. I can't tell okay, so if you see I don't know if you can see that, but on this sign, I think it says, yeah, $220,000, right? That's, and those are the houses that are replacing units where, like these little houses here, probably the people that were renting in those little shotgun houses were probably renting somewhere around maybe $400 a month, right? And then so it's being replaced with houses that cost, $220,000. And so that was creating a real challenge for us. So our response was to figure out how we could, create more architectural language in the neighborhood that could start to speak symbolically to the potential developers that are kind of coming in, right? And that was kind of our, that was our way of dealing with it. And I've always been one who liked to work kind of incrementally, and I like to think about things in small scale because I think small scale can have big impact. But and also you can actually be riskier, the smaller the scale, and so on and so forth. But we're kind of at a point right now that it's a very tough challenge for the work that we're doing, and it's scary, it's exciting, and I always tell people we're probably going to lose, but we're going to fight the fight, and I'm going to show you a little bit about what that challenge is. But before I do that, I'm going to ask you guys. So somebody told me this the other day that made so much sense, and it's going to be something I'll use for a long time. They asked me if I knew who Jack Swilling. Anybody know that name? Anybody here from Arizona? Apparently, this guy Jack Swilling in the mid 1800s shows up in Arizona, where Phoenix is, and said he wants to start a city. And people are like, you can't do that. There's no water out there. And so he goes on, and and apparently he hired a geologist and said, is there water out here? I'm buying some land out here, and I want to build stuff and some water. And the geologist said, yeah, well, you got to go 100 feet. So he gets a guy with a truck to dig a well. The guy goes out, dig the well, and 100 feet, there's no water. So he goes back to the geologist and says, there's no water. He says, well, you got to go further. Go to 100 feet, 150 feet. So he does that, no water. Go to 200 feet. Finally, the guy who's digging the wells comes over and says, well, Mr. Swilling, I have to tell you that we got water. And he jumped for joy, and he's like, let's get the pipes in, let's get the pumps in. And the guy said, but wait, Mr. Welling, I thought you might want me to just kind of keep on digging wells with this little truck I've got here while you go out and buy up all this land. Because the moment I put in a pump out there, folks are going to know this has value. So that's the story is that's the way Phoenix got started, right? So this guy took the advice of the well digger, and he went out and bought all the land, and then once he had the land, then he started putting in the pumps, and he was able to, build a city. That's a very valuable lesson, because this was our water, right? This is a neighborhood park in the 3rd Ward of Houston, where Project Row Houses is. It's about 3 or 4 blocks away, and community, people want to do good things, but having that kind of foresight, it becomes really critical. A group of older African Americans, this park is called Emancipation Park. It was given to the city by freed slaves, and to have a park for black people. And so it's very historic, and a lot of people wanted to do something nice with it. It's a small park. It's only 10 acres. And so my sense about this park was that we should green it up, make it really nice, and just do a little bit of infrastructural stuff. But that wasn't enough for the community. The community wanted something big and grand. And so they came up with this idea of this plan. They were going to put $38 million into it, and they announced it to the public. And then there goes the problem, right? We didn't buy the land. We started to build the park first. So consequently, now this is what's happening in our neighborhood. This is the language that's being used by real estate folks to basically drive the real estate value up in this neighborhood. From about 2.5, 3 years ago, you could probably buy property in this area for about $12 to $15 a square foot. Within a 2 to 3 year period, it's gone up to $40 a square foot. And it was very quick turnaround. So it's huge. And so this whole new kind of wave of activity is going on. As you can see here, like the cost of housing, that one I showed you earlier, that was at $220,000. That was from maybe about 9 or 10 years ago. And now you can see on the top end there, the second one is $610,000. So it's just constantly, it's like, this neighborhood is just kind of moving like crazy. While the real estate movement in terms of people buying stuff is going up, and people are enjoying their new homes and so on and so forth, there are people that exist in the neighborhood who, they can't. Well, first of all, nobody's building houses for low-income folks, and then the housing stock that exists is disappearing, which means that it's driving the rent rates up. You can see there over 10% in the last 15 years there, just kind of, and a huge jump within the last 5 years. These are just sample rental rates in this area. It's and this is reflective of the rents for people that are living in basically, substandard housing, or actually the housing that we're producing. That kind of fits our range. In fact, the housing that we've developed over the years probably pushed the rental up a little bit, because ours was, we weren't in the $400 a month range. Our housing kind of started in the $550 or so range. So, but it was still closer to affordable than this kind of housing that's happening throughout. And so if you see these little pink spots here, the way that things happen in the city of Houston is that if someone buys a single family lot that has one house on it, if you buy it for $100,000, then you can replat it, they call it replatting, subdivide it, and build 4. And if you do 4, and you can sell those 4 for anywhere from $300,000 to nearly $500,000, there's a lot of money to be made, right? And so therefore, and every week the city publish replatting maps, and this is a replatting map of 1 week. So there's a lot of properties that are set up to go there. But the upside of it, though, is that this is kind of the landscape of what's happening there. And so we've had to shift our activities into a real planning mode, to go back in and start figuring out how do we, work as artists. How do we, we're looking at generating a campaign to actually address the people who are moving into the neighborhood, so that they come into the neighborhood with a deeper level of respect for the history of it, as opposed to being alienated by it. We're also, the big challenge that we have is that we see that we have a great resource. All that blue property is property that's owned by organizations, churches, and so on and so forth. That's a good chunk of property, right? But I'm having to go away from this kind of thinking small scale. We've got to think, we've got to make this property that we have a huge impact. And also we have to continue to acquire property because we have the advantage of a lot of the people who own property in the neighborhood. We have relationships with them. But the challenge is digging up the capital to work at the same level as the private developers. So, I wanted to tell you just about this part, though, because this work it's gratifying, it's interesting, and you can kind of you get all these great rewards, but the challenges keep coming time after time after time. You think you've solved one issue, and then you turn around, and then there's another challenge on the other side, which actually is not so much of a problem for me, because I think that's where the poetics of the arts come in, and that it's fertile ground for us. And so the the nerve-wracking side is that we have the pressures of all this development going on, but the inspiring side and the exciting side is that, how are we going to respond to this? What's going to come out of this next? And I'm really looking forward to that. And so we've been going through this process of, kind of moving. The slide at the top is one of our more community-based meetings with just community folks. Then the slide at the bottom is where we're bringing in other resources, planners, architects, and so on and so forth, who are embedding themselves within the community effort that we're involved in to try to figure this, this process out. I'm going to switch now to another project, Translation, Vickery Meadow. Now, this is a project that I'm finding there's some parallels to what's happened with Project Row Houses, but in a shorter period of time. The interesting thing about this project is that it's in an unlikely place. Vickery Meadow is in kind of the northern, just northeast of downtown, and as you can see on this map, all this blue there, that's all residential housing. It was one of the largest concentration of apartment complexes in the city, having over 15,000 units of apartments in this area, and there are all these kind of garden apartment spaces. So I was invited by the Nasher Sculpture Center to do a project in Dallas. They took me to this neighborhood. They showed me these, apartments that did not look inspiring at all. I mean, it's not that interesting. But then as you kind of, the thing that they kept telling me though was that it's interesting, you gotta go there, you gotta hang out there, and it's filled with so much crime. I mean, there's this crime everywhere. And so when you go to the neighborhood, I just took these, I show these images because these are just kind of like a normal day, right? Just kind of going through, and you could just, there's this police presence all the time. I mean, from the tower that they have placed in the neighborhood to, people sitting on a corner. Next thing you know, there's 4 or 5, police cars that are just kind of surrounding. So there's always this sense of danger and fear there. But the thing that I found that was interesting about this neighborhood, though, was that over the years, this area that was built mainly for middle-class white college grads had kind of turned over time. It was built in the 1970s, so by the early to mid 90s, it had 20 plus years of depreciation, and then the Fair Housing Act kind of forced some of the rearrangement of some of these apartments so that they weren't all catered toward single people. So they had to add 4-bedroom apartments and so on and so forth to handle families and all. And so at that point, lower income folks start moving in. Mainly it was Black and Latinos at that time. But around 2002 or so, the International Refugee Committee and Catholic Charities decided, since this neighborhood had so many apartments and there were always vacancies, that they could use this as a place to place refugees and immigrants. And so then all of a sudden you have a neighborhood that went from being, basically all white to being people all over. In fact, I was at a community meeting once, and one of the people that owned a number of the apartments there, he was probably in his late 80s. And by the way, there are 96 apartment complexes, and I think there's probably about 20-something owners. Right, so it's like, so this whole neighborhood is owned by a handful of people. And this guy, he went up and at this community meeting because they were talking about building a new housing development. And he got up and he goes, we got to do something about this neighborhood. When I built my property here, it was a good property. People were nice and whatever. Now it looks like the goddamn United Nations. And so he was like, just fussing about it and so on and so forth. But it was interesting, though, because he started the meeting out, the old angry guy, But the meeting closed with a young woman who went up and she said, she says, and I want to reflect back on Mr. whatever his name was, who said that this, that Vickery Meadow looks like the United Nations. She goes, and that's exactly why I moved here, And so you have this kind of bookend of place where there, some people they want to see the old days, and then there are others that want to embrace, where it is and where they are now. So I went on this effort to kind of figure out, how do we create something to deal with that conversation? So I put together a group of people, and we, my process is generally kind of from, in the community setting, group setting to on the streets, individual, and so on and so forth. And so we started to kind of go through and talk to people. And one of the things that came up was that there was a group of people that had decided that the crime in the neighborhood may not have to do with, just people are just being criminals, but it might have to do with the fact that people don't know each other because there are all these people there from different places. And so they started something they called the Mom's Lunch. And they would bring together, 4 or 5 women from maybe, 5 or 6 different countries, and they would have lunch, and they would just share stories and tell stories and so on and so forth. And I managed to go to one of those lunches, and it was one of the most amazing things that I had experienced, to be in a room where, first of all, you had there had to be translators all around the room, because whenever somebody would tell their story, it had to be translated into English, and then it was translated back out. And it was like this beautiful sound of voices that was really interesting to me, and also just to see the way that people were going out, and opening themselves up. So I thought, that's the kind of that's the kind of connectedness that neighborhoods like this need, right? And so I've tried to figure out how can we do that on a broader scale. So we figured that maybe we would try to do a market, and have a market so that people could come together around things in a market. But then we had to figure out, how do we get things to the market, and what do we bring to the market? So we started to ask people if they made things that they could bring to the market. And of course, the beginning response was, people didn't really have much, but what we decided to do is we just get some apartments, and we would open them up as open studios and just invite people to come to make stuff, And so out of that, all these people started emerging as really wonderful, craftspeople, artisans, and so on and so forth. And then we started to get a sense that we had stuff that we could put on a market. But the challenge was that what I kept getting from people both inside the neighborhood and outside the neighborhood was like, but you'll never get people to come together because everybody's afraid, and so on and so forth. So we decided to have a food event and see what would happen. So we actually put out a call, and we asked if people would provide food from their culture, and we were hoping that we'd get 5 or 6 different people. We were hoping that we'd get 5 or 6 people, but to our surprise, it turned out to be amazing. Poetic afternoon, hot August evening in Dallas, and so we're sitting up and we're thinking, maybe we'll get 20, 30 people or so. And people just start coming, and people start bringing their dishes and so on and so forth. And it just, and it just turned into this thing that we were like, we might have something here. So then we decided to kind of, to really push it and see if we could kind of make this place in an area that people said no one would go to, and that it was all, people talked about it being dangerous and so on and so forth. And just to see what happened, because on this particular event, there were people that came from the museum group because they were curious of what was happening. And then the people in the neighborhood all came, and it was a very interesting dynamic. So then we moved forward to figure out how we could broaden this. And so, listening to people in the neighborhood and not trying to prescribe things and trying things out. Somebody said, we said, well, we have to figure out what we're going to do with the next little event to make it unique and interesting. And when we were trying to figure out how do we get the resources to have talent and performances and so on and so forth, someone suggested a talent show. And we thought, talent show, talent shows are terrible generally. But we said, let's give it a shot. And of course, making the flyers and trying to figure out, how do you communicate with everybody, and people just kind of came up with this idea. If you can just have somebody's language on there, just saying hello or whatever, just so that people feel like, that this event speaks to them in some way. So, so we kind of pushed this thing together, and once again, with the talent show, it was very much so the same. I mean, yeah, it was the same as it happened with the food thing, right? Low expectations, and then it just turned out to be pretty incredible. Next, instead of a few members to perform, we ended up having like 20-something performers with a range from 18-month-old little girl from Somalia to an 86-year-old white guy doing a hokey pokey, and all these different things in between. And what was really most interesting, though, was kind of seeing how you'd have like families from Bhutan, sitting there checking out the Latino or African American rappers or whatever, or the Azteca dance group. Everybody's kind of it was just this moment of cultural sharing that became we found that was a very valuable thing in this process. So, but then there was a challenge to think about. So how do you honor the art of people who are working at a higher level than just the market? So how do you show that work? So we had to figure that out. And we thought about just getting some additional apartments and whitewashing them and showing work in an apartment. But that didn't quite feel right to me. And one day I was talking to a friend of mine who actually lives here in LA, Mark Bradford, who started Art in Practice. I was talking to Mark one day, and he was all excited about his show that he was going to be doing at White Cube in London. And we were talking about his price point, how much it was going up, because of this show at White Cube. And I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, I can't believe this. And he was like, yeah, this whole notion of White Cube, I mean, that's the essence of the commercialization of art, in the White Cube kind of thing. And so I just kind of, I kind of jokingly said this idea is, hell, we need some white cubes in Dallas, for this group of people that we're working with there. And so I went back to Dallas on my next trip there, and I met with these architects, and I said, we want to have a place that we can show work by artists who are, who are doing paintings and, just drawings and stuff that needs a higher level of presentation than just at a market. And we talked about it, and I said, well, something that's just like 12 by 12 foot square inside. I mean, that we can do sheetrock walls and so on and so forth. It can be kind of temporary, but we just want to try this out. And so so these guys agreed to giving it a shot. So we ended up with these little boxes that we call white cubes, and so we placed them throughout the neighborhood, because basically this was a neighborhood that was, like I said, was built in the 1970s as a garden apartment community, which means, it wasn't about streets and sidewalks. Everybody drove their cars to their apartment complex, and when they needed stuff, they would drive out. But as the neighborhood exists now, people in the neighborhood, they're walking. I mean, all these people, they don't have cars and stuff, so they're walking, and they're trying, there's no bus stops, no bus shelters, and so on and so forth. So when we did these little white cubes, they became kind of these focal points throughout the neighborhood where, and like I said, people use them to see exhibitions, or sometimes people use them just for bus shelters and stuff. So we've been able to, we were able to curate, all kinds of shows and so on and so forth in the White Cube, and also kind of around them as well. But the challenge with this project, as I said, is somewhat similar to Project Row Houses, but in a more condensed version, because when we first started working in this place, there were people that were saying that nobody's going to go there, it's a terrible place, so on and so forth. Well, within a fairly short period of time, we were able to highlight it in a way that got people excited about it, right? And so all of a sudden, the real estate people start using it, against us. They started, using the kind of renewed identity of the neighborhood to start elevating prices and so on and so forth. And so it's cost us actually in that we've actually even had to move the white cubes from locations because, the developers see this opportunity to actually to go back to their kind of garden apartment style, and for instance, there's one of the cubes that was really so wonderfully located that it was a place that you always see people kind of dropping in, they get off the bus, they stop. It also served great as a bus stop and so on and so forth. But we had to have permission from the property owner to put it there. And we got a call from them one day saying they wanted us to move it. And we're like, why do you want us to move it? I mean, it's working perfectly. I mean, there are people there, whatever. And they said, yeah, but we don't want people. I mean, that's not our, we don't want people around our property. And so we were kind of working in a way that was somewhat, that was in contradiction to what some of the property owners wanted. So what we've ended up doing is we've kind of refocused the project in a storefront, and I've got a great artist who just graduated from Otis in May, who's actually running the project. She's pretty amazing, Carol Zhu. She was with the Yarn Bombers here. Yeah. Carol she heard about the project over a year and a half ago, and she just started coming. She's from Austin, so she would come to events and stuff all the time until eventually we ended up getting her engaged with the projects. And so she's, so the point for us now is really figuring out how we turn the project more inward and focusing mainly on the residents and not so much looking at, the kind of broader urban context of it, because that's something that we're still addressing through our advocacy work, but not in terms of in a more public way. And so now we're able to kind of look at what are the kinds of things, what are the kind of skill sets that we can help people gather and get them out into the market as opposed to bringing a market into the neighborhood. I'll give you an example about the market thing too that's really interesting. There was someone with a green market in another neighborhood, and they heard about what we were doing, and they said, this is so great. We'd love to have a food market component to it. And of course, we were excited about that, right? But as it turned out, their market that they were interested in doing, the price point was like so high that it had no relation to the people in the neighborhood. And then when it came down to it about placing the market, they wanted to place it on the edge of the neighborhood. So basically, they could leverage the kind of the media hype around the neighborhood, but not necessarily be fully, inside. And so it was so all those kind of tricky things started to happen. So we kind of figured out how to pull back, but now we have a lot of these folks that are actually getting their work out. The museum stores, the museum also has a mall there that we're engaged with, but the amazing thing though is just that kind of unleashing the creativity of people, of a community. To me, that's the most incredible and most valuable thing of the work that I do, that I get to see this opportunity. I get to be a facilitator for other people to find that part of their lives, which is pretty amazing. And this woman on the left-hand slide in the lower right-hand corner up there, Ana Hernandez is just she's pretty amazing. Like, she has an Aztec dance group, and they don't have a lot of resources and stuff. So she's got 100 people in her troupe, and they were gonna they needed their regalia, and they didn't have the resources. So all these guys and everybody came, and they just brought their sewing machines, and they just start making the outfits, and it's all hand painted and so on and so forth. It's pretty amazing to see, when people kind of, take that stuff on. So also Arabic classes and so on and so forth. But this is the last one of this one though. This is one of the projects that Carol actually kind of brought through, was this notion of I am beautiful, which is really pretty. It was amazing to kind of be a part of that program there and to be there. That's Carol in the lower left-hand side, standing in the back looking at our camera. But she was, she was like, trying to figure out a way that people can actually talk about beauty, and the beauty of different cultures and so on and so forth. So that's been like really kind of a really amazing process there. So I'm going to go through this one kind of quickly. Next slide. It's a proposed project that gets at the core of my belief that we have to figure out how we. Well, for me, my work is really about figuring out how to create a platform for other people to access their creativity, right? Because when Joseph Beuys talked about the idea of social sculpture, his vision of this was that we needed to think of the world as a big piece of sculpture, and that we're all sculpting it, at any given time, but in order to do that, his thing was that everybody is an artist. Well, my thing is I don't think everybody is an artist, but I think everybody have the capacity. And so how do we elevate that capacity so that everybody is actually engaging at their highest and creative self? And so this was a project that was, this community development group had been doing lots of great community development work, but apparently somebody suggested to them that, well, but your community development work is not really, really, really good until you get some art in it. So you got to have art in your community development stuff. So they put out a request for proposals for artists to, propose ideas. I didn't want to do it because I'm not generally interested in, they were calling it a public art project, and I wasn't so much interested in a traditional public art, and I'm not that interested in it for myself. But when I saw what they were looking for, the goals, and I saw things like, integrating art into the everyday and the functional, and engaging residents and local businesses, and so on and so forth, I thought, well, that's something that has some. I'm interested in that stuff, and plus people kept the consultant that was working on it with them kept asking me to apply, and so on and so forth. So I did a proposal that I thought, let's just propose something that will really turn this whole thing upside down, right? And try to challenge and push them. And it pushed them to the point that they pushed us out eventually. But it's a project I think that is worth kind of, there's still value in it, and I think at some point it might find a way into the world. So this is a neighborhood, this Opelika, Florida. It's in the area that they're focusing on. They call it the Triangle, which is mostly African Americans, actually all African Americans within the Triangle. And the Triangle apparently had become so violent in the 80s that they had blocked off all the streets. I'll show you another slide that will show the streets and stuff. But the curious thing about it was that apparently when the neighborhood was built out in the early 1920s, the guy was fascinated with Moorish architecture, and he just thought, I'm going to build this Moorish architecture here. Make it. That's going to be the kind of, these are going to be the focal points of the architecture here. And so this is the actual triangle, and you can see where the streets that go through, they were all barricaded at the end on 151st Street, or is it 51st? Whatever it is. Anyway, that area all the streets were barricaded. So if you went in off of North 22nd, you had to go back out to go around, right? So it's all, but, in the last several years, they decided, well, things have gotten so much better, we need to open those up. And their idea was that they would put these gateways, they would have sculpture and so on and so forth in these gateways. And which was really kind of a little odd for me, because when we went on the site visit, what I heard people say was that there were two things that people mainly said. They said, first of all, they said, we know why you're here. You guys just want to you just want to tear things down and run us out of here. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing they said is well, if you really want to do something for this neighborhood, people need jobs. So we need work. We don't, art, what is that? We need jobs. So I took that into consideration, and we start looking at the little buildings that were at the at each of those gateway sites were scheduled to be torn down. So that was their solutions, that you tear them down. And but we had this different idea that what we would do with each of the gateways, keeping the buildings and designating them for different things that we've found that people in the neighborhood were interested in, right? They were interested in jobs, they were interested in education, they were interested in recreation, and they thought, okay, art and culture, that's good. The fifth one, I'm missing the fifth one. But anyway, so what we call them zones. So we would have an employment zone, an education zone, and so on and so forth. And we would do these kind of residencies within these houses to actually work with them, to actually help them build out their neighborhood the way that they want to see it. So we thought, even just from an aesthetic standpoint, right? So we take these examples of things like where people have been, traditionally, they paint their own houses in these decorative ways and so on and so forth. On the lower right-hand side, that's a house just across the street from Project Row Houses, where this old lady, she does this old traditional southern style thing where you sweep your yard, so there's a certain part of it that's, so there are all these interesting kind of cultural things where like, we can actually train people how to do this themselves. So instead of us like, going out spending a whole bunch of money on sculpture, we let the people kind of design and create their own place, right? And, we would serve as, basically the facilitators and the teachers and help them kind of figure out how to adapt some kind of aesthetic language that could give this kind of new identity of the neighborhood. And so we proposed these whole things of like there are fences throughout the area that you can kind of, there are these opportunities it's not just about, the painting of the thing, but it's also about, engaging with the property owners and getting people to be involved with it and so on and so forth. Individual families, their households and that kind of stuff, getting them engaged. Commercial places, how do you get them involved with the process of being, giving them some connection to, the growth and the aestheticizing of their neighborhood. And having these zones kind of set up where there may be youth zones where they're being educated to do parts of it. The workforce zone in terms of landscaping and so on and so forth, helping them, so these people are learning, but they're also, they're getting paid, through this process. So then you could kind of have these little cul-de-sacs or whatever. You could just start to, they could be little park spaces, so on and so forth. But the main thing of it was to be able to be in a process though where you just kind of work people through the aesthetics of it. So you go from this kind of way of looking at it, and then you're adding stuff to it, and it gets more sophisticated over time as people learn and and gain more skills. And then you get all the way to maybe at some point you can have a du buffet, in the middle. But you just kind of work it through in a slow fashion. But in the real radical part of this idea, though, was to look at taking a budget that they had, that basically they would say, for this sculpture we would pay this amount and this amount and this amount and this amount. We stretched it out in a way in which, if you notice, like the artist's fees in year one was lower than the fees for the residents, because we're just training them, and the residents are actually working to do it. And they continue to, it stays that way until when you get to year 4, basically the idea is that you've trained enough people that they have some skills and they can go outside of the community and find employment. And then you can start going back and investing in artists to come back and bring their creativity, into the process. And and this was it was one of those things that they liked the idea of the engagement part, but they couldn't understand. They couldn't understand that kind of. They couldn't trust the creativity of a community to actually make that transformation at this point. And but we're hopeful that it'll get there. I'm going to close out with a couple of little things that to me symbolically give me my confidence that people have it within them to do amazing things, right? Okay. Well, this is this woman to me represents the essence of that whole thing about the potential of transformation. So I met Asada Richards in I must have I met her before I started Project Row Houses as an activist within the community. She was a very, angry person. She had so many challenges and so on and so forth. This is her on the left-hand side, bottom, when we first started out, when I first met her. And she was one of the first women in our Young Mothers program. And I advocated against her because I just didn't think I was like, there's no hope for this person. She's not going to fit in. She's too angry, so on and so forth. Well, she got into the program, and immediately she just started to kind of warm up to people, and she was on academic probation at the University of Houston at the time, in between her second and third year. But so once she got into the program, though, she completely transformed. She ended up finishing school there, going off, getting a scholarship to a PhD program at Penn State, which she finished in 5 years. She ended up teaching at the University of Pittsburgh for a few years, and then decided she wanted to come back to Houston. So she came back to Houston, and the mayor of Houston heard about her story and actually tapped into her to be a commissioner on the housing authority, and she ran a very good race for city council just last year, and I think she's going to run again, and I think she'll win. But this is incredible transformation, and I think that potential is in everybody, right? But we just have to figure out how do we pull it out, and how do we create the right environment for it to happen. And the final one is this guy. Annette, you've heard me tell this story a number of times. So this guy's name is Eugene Howard, and he called himself brother-in-law. And the reason he called himself brother-in-law, he said, is because he's so cool. He'll end up like marrying your sister if you're not careful. It's like I'm the ladies' man. He's the ladies' man kind of a guy. So, but I met this guy when he showed up at Project Row Houses around 2000, I think it was. He had been in prison for 20-something years, and he had come back, and the neighborhood had completely changed, and he didn't have family or anything in Houston any longer, and so somebody told him that he should come and hang out at Project Row Houses, that we would try to help him. Well, he would just come there every day, and over time he started helping to clean up, and he would just do all kind of little things to kind of help out. And then at a certain point, I started giving him money. And every time I give him money, he would come back with these big plates of barbecue. And I would try to explain to him that I wasn't giving it to him so he would cook for us. I was trying to help him out. So this kept going on for a few years. And then so one day I asked him, I said, so brother-in-law, if you could start your life over again, what would you like to have done? What would have been your dream to be? And he said, well, since I like cooking, maybe I would have liked to have a cafe. And so I've kind of, thought, well, let's do a portrait of him, of him in his dream state. And I've been doing these with other people in the neighborhood. So I ended up doing one of brother-in-law, right? And because he has this kind of thing, he was like, he considered himself like always on call for people, like he'd come and help out, or he'll do this and do that. It's like everybody needs somebody like that will come in and hang out, especially if they're going to bring you barbecue. And so, so we did this as just a little, poster thing, and we put it around the neighborhood. And he felt so much pride because people would see his photo and all this stuff. And then we actually start hiring him to, if we had an event or something going on, we'd ask him to cook and so on and so forth. And all of a sudden, it just kind of caught on. And so then all of a sudden, he became like this kind of, he became this personality within the community, and and actually, kind of found himself in a way that he had never thought, and he added so much value to this community. He actually died in 2013, and I always just think about how like I guess this project went on from maybe about 2007 or so to 2013. And it's amazing, to see, just his capacity to contribute to the neighborhood once he had a proper platform and a context with which to do it. And so I think all these projects, when I started out and I was talking about, I like to think of things in small scale. I understand that the large scale sometimes is where, you have to find yourself, you have to play there. But I think it always goes back to, these small intimate moments in terms of, how do we build the capacity for each and every person that is a part of our community. Thank you.
I think it's both your process, the way you work, and then seeing, I guess you call the product, the outcome that happens, that's been intriguing me so much. I think the first time was the New York Times piece they did of you, intriguing me and the art world. I think it's you have such a subtle way of working with people that has challenged us to think about what is the role of the artist in doing this kind of work. And also, I think, having seen you, the way you do it is so unhurried, and involves a lot of hanging out almost, right? And so some words that I would use to describe, to try to articulate what it is you do, I think one thing you do is you notice things, often things that have been overlooked, like the shotgun houses or brother-in-law. And you listen to the aspirations of people, you work from that. And then you value things undervalued phenomena. And I think that the most active thing you do is you start to suggest. I don't know if you would characterize what your process is that way, but then what happens is almost something magical, transformations that you were sharing with us. And I think part of why that happens is because you don't do a boilerplate process or program when you go through this process. And I know a lot of people have been inspired by you and want to do work like that, but it's so easy to start doing the boilerplate, And we've also talked about some of the other places you worked at, other residencies you've had. And I remember the one in Anyang, Korea, you talked about. I don't know if you would characterize it this way, but it was I think they had some expectations about more directed, action-oriented approach, and not to stereotype all Koreans. I think of Kyung Park and his SLAB, right? But my question is, I wonder under what conditions you work well, your process. Like, what are some of the essentials you need that you found? Because you've gone to so many places now, and so I wonder if you found certain qualities or structures or expectations that are conducive to you in this kind of process.
Time is the most valuable aspect of my work, because you just have to have time. You can't force stuff. I get my kind of slow approach from a mentor of mine in Houston, and if you were to meet him, he's slow about everything. I mean, he drives down the road in his truck with all of his junk on the back. He drives about 5 miles per hour. I've run on foot to catch him from time to time. When he's passed me up, I can catch him on foot. But he's observing things. He picks up things, right? He's always picking up things. He makes work out of found objects and so on and so forth. Kind of almost in the line of like John Outerbridge, who's here, LA-based artist. But one of the things that his name is Jessie Lott. But one of the things that Jessie's always saying to me is that, even when you're sculpting or whatever art you're making, you have to listen. You have to pay attention. You have to. I mean, if you're really, if the nature of your work is to be aggressive and force things, and that's a whole different approach. But for most of it, his point is like, it's already there. The work is already there. Just, do you have the ability to notice it, to observe it, to find it, and then the patience to allow it to happen? So I go to his studio, and it's just like, it's filled with it's work that's that he's been working on for some pieces he's been working on for 20 years. Where he's allowing things to kind of come over time. And just the other day I was at a studio, and I was like, there were these he just started doing these wood carvings of feet, and I was like, oh my God, look at that foot. And he was like, yeah, like nobody can make that, because it was like, that's he saw it in the wood, and he those minimal, intervention he had to do with it. And I think that becomes crucial and critical in terms of working with communities, because the more you have to assert yourself and intervene, the less you're allowing the opportunity for others, to realize their potential and their possibility of contributing. And really, it's hard to make change on a community scale without that kind of involvement. If you got a lot of money, you can go in and you can build things, and you can build schools and get people in schools and so on and so forth. And that's one way of doing stuff. But I'm really interested in the empowerment side of it, where things are not done for people, but it's done with people in a way that they're empowered along the process.
Hi, I'm a Los Angelino, and my grandfather was the founder of the first African American life insurance company, and he was from Houston. His name was William Nickerson. So I'm very much intrigued with what you're doing. However, with the 21st century and computers, how has this age of technology did it stifle your creativity, or what do you feel about this technology age and what you're doing?
Technology is a tool, and anytime you can, master a tool, I think it's a great thing. So for me, but my way of working though is generally not to master tools. I try not to get myself in a situation where I say, oh, technology, I got to understand technology. Because I work with people. And so I try to say, well, is there a person I know that loves technology that I can kind of help, create a circumstance and a situation in which they can bring that, into the project. And so that's kind of my relationship with it personally. And then in terms of how it's impact the work in general, I think is somewhat challenging a little bit, because people are not, it used to be, that, people were accustomed to having to get out, be in person, to show up, and not just say things on Facebook or on, Instagram or whatever, that you actually had to be there. And I think, that's one of the big challenges that we face as, people that are interested in community engagement, is how do we make real meaningful community connections. It's a bit of a challenge, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I should mention the portion afterwards with the workshop. We're exploring digital technology and art, but not in the sleek, smart city view, but how can you engage different communities?
And like you said earlier that like you were in a fight that you're probably going to lose. So like, can you like describe the fight and who are like, I guess, the enemies or whatever? And like, what do you think that we need for like you to be able to win the fight?
I really try to manage people's expectations, because that's a tough one, right? Is that, some people go at it from other angles, right? And it can work either way. Some people sell people on the possibility and the potential, right? And, and that's the way they gather people. I kind of have people, I like for people to go into things with a sense of skepticism, and understanding the challenges and so on and so forth. I think though the thing so I don't necessarily truly believe that we're going to lose. Because I think we have some I even kind of showed you some reasons why we might have a pretty good chance, because we own a lot of property there. But what I'm focused on in terms of the large, trying to dream big for a moment, and go and scale up, is trying to figure out how to access or expand the network, expand the network, as I showed you in that last image of Project Row Houses and the planning stuff. It's like, so we can't do this as a community only. I mean, we have to be able to open ourselves up to other people that are willing to participate and be a part of the network. And I think the big challenge right now is to tap into people in the, in the financing industry, because that's where our biggest hurdle is.
How do you like mix those two, the art and then the practical, so that individuals can get both? And then my other question was related to that, in terms of funding. Like, how do you get the funding to do that? Like, you have all of these amazing things and tapping into like resources. Where do you find those resources?
So your first question, my training is I was trained professionally as a painter, as an artist, right? But, my humanistic tendencies were never supplanted by that, right? So it's always, the impact on society has always been at the forefront of my work, even as, someone who's, making paintings and stuff. So the way that my approach is generally, I always tell people, I start with the practical. I mean, I start with what it is I want to do, right? I mean, if I want to build a house, or if I want to, open a grocery store, or if I want to do whatever it is, that practical thing that I want to do, that's where I start. If I use my mentor, Mr. Jessie, as an example, when he starts to make a carving of a foot, he starts out with a practical thing of chopping away at some wood. That's really what he's doing. He's just chopping away at wood. Very practical thing, right? But as he's doing that, then he can start to see things that he can shape it in certain ways that gives it a value that's beyond just the chopping away at the wood. People often would ask me and say, well, why do you have to call what you do art? Why can't it just be, community development or whatever? And now there is a talk that I've been doing about the notion about what is art and who gets to decide what art is, because art is a very powerful thing, not just in itself, but also in its relation to resources, right? There are some people that can make this wooden table here, and they may be able to, I don't know, maybe they get $200 for this table, $200 or $300 for this table. There's somebody else that could make this table and get $200,000 or $300,000 for it, right? And a lot of that, just has to do with the language and how you talk about it and how you, perceive it. And so, to me, I leverage that and I use that. I use my training and my ability to understand the context of art and art theory to be able to contextualize what it is that I do, just like, Marcel Duchamp contextualized a urinal, as a work of art. It's just a urinal, right? But it was contextualized in a way that has increased its value incredibly, right? So I do the same thing in terms of the work that I do. I use it as a tool for funding purposes.
What you've been talking about reminded me of an article, I think it was in the New Yorker or New York Times recently, about a success in a neighborhood also in Houston or Dallas, and just like community organizing there. And it was pretty depressing because the people, when they were asked what made it succeed, their response was like, well, we just asked the low-income people what they needed in that neighborhood and we facilitated it. And you were talking a lot about how you attribute a lot of your success to having faith in the potential of the people you're helping. And I guess this is maybe a more conceptual question, but have you encountered any like structural ways of getting through maybe the like ego or elitism of the people in power to like get them to believe that? Because you're like, that's actually what will help everyone, is if you put more faith in them rather than like you thinking that you're the one who knows how it'll work. That was a convoluted question, so I can clarify if you need it.
Yeah, clarify.
Okay, I guess maybe a better question is, what have been some of your specific ways of doing the convincing for people to tell them that, like, I know what you want to do, but we need to have faith in the people we're actually trying to help, that they will facilitate our end goal, rather than like we're going to exist in this separate thing and like conceptually think about the people we're going to help, but not actually think about what they need and what they want.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I kind of think of it all. When I, you say convince them, I also put myself in the category of them as well, right? I'm constantly having to kind of, answer my own question. I mean, how do we get to the point that we can, have faith in people to that they have the capacity to know who they are and to and to contribute, and that is something that that I think you have to work. I find myself working really hard to try to convince people in the community that they have capacity. I have to convince people who are from outside the community who potentially support that people have capacity. I have to convince myself sometimes, that there's capacity. So it's not, so the one thing I try to own all the same weaknesses that everybody around me that I'm working with have, right? I mean, I haven't been gifted with anything that is so much greater than anybody else. It's just that sometimes I have some experiences that's given me a few different opportunities or ways to look at things, but I'm still, I find myself all the time back at ground zero, at square one, thinking, why didn't I know that?